Section 12 of Astounding Stories 16, April 1931. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Astounding Stories 16, April 1931 by Various. The World Behind the Moon, Part 2. Witcher started to say something in reply, then gazed, hypnotized, at the opposite wall of the jungle. From the dense screen of lavender foliage stretched a glistening, scale-armored neck, as thick as a man's body at its thinnest point, which was just behind a tremendous-jawed crocodilian head. It tapered back for a distance of at least 30 feet to merge into a body as big as that of a terrestrial whale, that was supported by 4 squat, ponderous legs. Moving with surprising rapidity, the enormous thing slid into the mud and began plowing away, belly deep, through the pool. Shapeless, slow-writhing forms were cast up in its wake, to quiver for a moment in the sunlight and then melt below the mud again. One of the bloated, formless mud crawlers was snapped up in the huge jaws with an abrupt plunge of the long neck, and the monster began to feed, hog-like, slobbering over the loathsome carcass. Witcher shook his head, half in fanatical eagerness, half in despair. "I'd like to stay and see more," he said with a sigh, "but if that's the kind of creatures we're apt to encounter in the Zoidian jungle, we better be going at once." "Shh!" snapped Joyce. Then, in a barely audible whisper, "I think the thing heard your voice." The monster had abruptly ceased its feeding. Its head was waving inquisitively from side to side. Suddenly it expelled the air from its vast lungs in a roaring cough, and started directly for their tree. "Shoot!" cried Witcher, raising his gun. Moving with the speed of an express train, the monster had almost got to their overhanging branch before they could pull the triggers. Both shells embedded themselves in the enormous chest, just as the long neck reached up for them, and at once things began to happen with cataclysmic rapidity. Almost with their impact the shells exploded. The monster stopped, with a great hole torn in its body. Then, dying on its feet, it thrust its great head up, and its huge jaws crouched over the branch to which its 2 puny destroyers were clinging. With all of its dozens of tons of weight, it jerked in a gargantuan death agony. The tree, enormous as it was, shook with it, and the branch itself was tossed as though in a hurricane. There was a splintering sound. Witcher and Joyce dropped their guns to cling more tightly to the bole of the drooping branch that was their only security. The guns glanced off the mountainous body, and, with a last convulsion of the mighty legs, were swept underneath. The monster was still at last, its insensate jaws yet gripping the bough. The 2 men looked at each other in speechless consternation. The shell a mile off through the dreadful jungle, themselves helpless without their guns. "Well," said Joyce at last, "I guess we better be on our way. Waiting here, thinking it over, won't help any. Luckily there's no night, for a couple of weeks at least, to come stealing down on us." He started down the great trunk, with Witcher following close behind. Walking as rapidly as they could, they hurried back along the tunneled trail toward their shell. They hadn't covered 100 yards when they heard a mighty crashing of underbrush behind them. Glancing back, they saw tooth-studded jaws gaping cavernously out of the end of a 30-foot neck, little dead-looking eyes glaring at them, a 100-foot body smashing its way over the trap bushes and through tangles of vines and down drooping branches. "The mate to the thing we killed back there," Joyce panted. "Run, for God's sake!" Witcher needed no urging. He hadn't an ounce of fear in his spare, small body, but he had an overwhelming desire to get back to Earth and deliver his message. He was trembling as he raced after Joyce, 30 feet to a bound, ducking his head to avoid hitting the thick lavender foliage that roofed the trail. "One of us must get through," he panted over and over. "One of us must make it." It was speedily apparent that they could never outrun their pursuer. The reaching jaws were only a few yards behind them now. "You go," called Joyce, sobbing for breath. He slowed his pace deliberately. No, you! Witcher slowed too. In a frenzy, Joyce shoved him along the trail. I tell you! He got no further. In front of him, where there had appeared to be solid ground, they suddenly saw a yawning pit. Desperately, they tried to veer aside, but they were too close. Their last long, bird-like leap carried them over the edge. They fell, far down, into a deep chasm, splashing into a shallow pool of water. A few clods of earth cascaded after them as the monster above dug its great splayed feet into the ground and checked its rush in time to keep from falling after them. Then the top of the pit slowly darkened as a covering of some sort slid across it. They were in a prison as profoundly quiet and utterly black as a tomb. "Dorn!" shouted Joyce. "Are you all right?" "Yes," came a voice in the near darkness. "And you?" "I'm still in one piece, as far as I can feel." There was a splashing noise. He waded toward it, and in a moment his outstretched hand touched the professor's shoulder. "This is a fine mess," he observed shakily. "We got away from those tooth-lined jaws all right, but I'm wondering if we're much better off than we would have been if we hadn't escaped." "I'm wondering the same thing." Witcher's voice was strained. "Did you see the way the top of the pit closed above us? That means we're in a trap, and a most ingenious trap it is too. The roof of it is camouflaged until it looks exactly like the rest of the trail floor. The water in here is just shallow enough to let large animals break their necks when they fall in, and just deep enough to preserve small animals, like ourselves, alive. We're in the hands of some sort of reasoning, intelligent beings, Joyce." "In that case," said Joyce with a shudder, "we'd better do our best to get out of here." But this was found to be impossible. They couldn't climb up out of the pit, and nowhere could they feel any openings in the walls. Only smooth, impenetrable stone met their questing fingers. "It looks as though we're in to stay," said Joyce finally. "At least until our Zoidian hosts, whatever kind of creatures they may be, come and take us out. What'll we do then? Sail in and die fighting? Or go peaceably along with them, assuming we aren't killed at once, on the chance that we can make a break later?" "I'd advise the latter," answered Witcher. "There's a small animal on our own planet whose example might be a good one for us to follow. That's the possum." He stopped abruptly and gripped Joyce's arm. From the opposite side of the pit came a grating sound. A crack of greenish light appeared, low down near the water. This widened jerkily, as though a door were being hoisted by some sort of pulley arrangement. The walls of the pit began to glow faintly with reflected light. "Down!" breathed Witcher. Noiselessly, they let themselves sink into the water until they were floating, eyes closed and motionless, on the surface. Playing dead to the best of their ability, they waited for what might happen next. They heard a splashing near the open rock door. The splashing neared them, and high-pitched hissing syllables came to their ears. Variegated sounds that resembled excited conversation in some unknown language. Joyce felt himself touched by something, and it was all he could do to keep from shouting aloud and springing to his feet at the contact. He'd had no idea, of course, what might be the nature of their captors, but he had imagined them as manlike, to some extent at least, and the touch of his hand, or flipper, or whatever it was, indicated that they were not. They were cold-blooded reptilian things, for the flesh that had touched him was cold, as clammy and repulsive as the belly of a dead fish. So repulsive was that flesh that, when he presently felt himself lifted high up and roughly carried, he shuddered in spite of himself at the contact. Instantly the thing that bore him stopped. Joyce held his breath. He felt an excruciating, stabbing pain in his arm, after which the journey through the water was resumed. Stubbornly, he kept up his pretense of lifelessness. The splashing ceased, and he heard flat, wet feet slapping along on dry rock, indicating that they had emerged from the pit. Then he sank into real unconsciousness. The next thing he knew was that he was lying on a smooth, bare rock in a perfect bedlam of noises. Howls and grunts, snuffling coughs and snarls beat at his eardrums. It was as though he had fallen into a vast cage in which were hundreds of savage, excited animals. Animals, however, that in spite of their excitement and ferocity were surprisingly motionless, for he heard no scraping of claws or patting of feet. Cautiously, he opened his eyes. He was in a large cave, the walls of which were glowing with greenish, phosphorescent light. Strewn about the floor were seemingly dead carcasses of animals. And what carcasses they were! Blubber-coated things that looked like giant tadpoles. Gazelle-like creatures with a single, long, slim horn growing from delicate, small skulls. Four-legged beasts and six-legged ones. Animals with furry hides and crawlers with scaled coverings. Several hundred assorted specimens of the smaller life of Zoid lay stretched out in seeming lifelessness. But they were not dead. These bizarre beasts of another world, they lived and were animated with the frenzied fear of trapped things. Joyce could see the tortured heaving of their furred and scaled sides as they panted with terror, and from their throats issued the outlandish noises he had heard. They were alive enough, only they seemed unable to move. There was nothing in his range of vision that might conceivably be the beings that had captured him. So Joyce started to lift his head and look around at the rest of the cavern. He found that he could not move. He tried again, and his body was as unresponsive as a log. In fact, he couldn't feel his body at all. In growing terror, he concentrated all his will on moving his arm. It was as limp as a rag. He relaxed, momentarily in the grip of stark, blind panic. He was as helpless as the howling things around him. He was numbed, completely paralyzed into immobility. The professor's voice, a weak, uncertain voice, sounded from behind him. "Joyce! Joyce!" He found that he could talk, and the paralysis that gripped the rest of his muscles had not extended to the vocal cords. "Dorn! Thank God you're alive! I couldn't see you, and I thought—" "I'm alive, but that's about all," said Witcher. I can't move." "Neither can I. We've been drugged in some manner, just as all the other animals in here had been drugged. I must have gotten my dose in the pit. I was cut, or stabbed, in the arm." Joyce stopped talking as he suddenly heard steps. Like human footsteps, yet weirdly different. Flapping sounds, as though awkward flippers were slapping along the rock floor toward them. The steps stopped within a few feet of them. Then, after what seemed hours, they sounded again, this time in front of him. He opened his eyes, cautiously, barely moving his eyelids, and saw at last, in every hideous detail, one of the super beasts that had captured Witcher and himself. It was a horrible cartoon of a man, the thing that stood there in the greenish glow of the cave. 9 or 10 feet high, it loomed hairless, with a faintly iridescent purplish hide. A thick, cylindrical trunk sloped into a neck only a little smaller than the body itself. Set on this was a bony, ugly head that was split clear across by lipless jaws. There was no nose, only slanted holes like the nostrils of an animal, and over these were set pale, expressionless, pupilless eyes. The arms were short and thick, and ended in bifurcated limbs of flesh, like swollen hands encased in old-fashioned mittens. The legs were also grotesquely short, and the feet were mere shapeless flaps. It was standing near one of the smaller animals, apparently regarding it closely. Observing it himself, Joyce saw that it was moving a little, as though coming out of a coma. It was raising its bizarre head and trying to get on its feet. Leisurely, the two-legged monster bent over. 2 long fangs gleamed in the lipless mouth. These were buried into the neck of the reviving beast, and instantly it sank back into immobility. Having reduced it to helplessness, the monster ate it. The lipless jaws gaped widely. The shapeless hands forced in the head of the animal. The throat muscles expanded hugely, and in less than a minute, it had swallowed its living prey as a boa constrictor swallows a monkey. Joyce closed his eyes, feeling weak and nauseated. He didn't open them again until long after he heard the last of the awkward, flapping footsteps. "Could you see it?" asked Witcher, who was lying so closely behind them that he couldn't observe the monstrous Zeudian. "What did it do? What was it like?" Joyce told them of the way the creature had fed. "We are evidently in their provision room," he concluded. "They keep some of their food alive, it seems. Well, it's a quick death." "Tell me more about the way the other animal moved just before it was eaten." "There isn't much to tell," said Joyce wearily. "It didn't move long after those fangs were sunk into it." "But don't you see?" There was sudden hope in Witcher's voice. "That means that the effect of the poison, which is apparently injected by those fangs, wears off after a time. And in that case..." "In that case," Joyce interjected, "we have only an unknown army of 10-foot Zeudians, the problem of finding a way to the surface of the ground again, and the lack of any kind of weapons to keep us from escaping." "We're not quite weaponless, though," the professor whispered back. "Over in a corner there's a pile of the long, slender horns that sprout from the heads of some of these creatures. Evidently the Zeudians cut them out, or break them off before eating that particular type of animal. They'd be as good as lances if we could get a hold of them." Joyce said nothing, but hope began to beat in his own breast. He had noticed a significant happening during the age-long hours in the commissary cave. Most of the Zeudians had entered from the direction of the pit, but one had come in through an opening in the opposite side, and this one had blinked pale eyes as though dazzled from a bright sunlight, and was bearing some large woody tubers that seemed to have been freshly uprooted. There was a good chance, thought Joyce, that that opening led to a tunnel up to the world above. He drew a deep breath and felt a dim pain in his back, caused by the cramping position in which he had lain for so long. He could have shouted aloud with the thrill of that discovery. This was the first time he had felt his body at all. Did that mean the effect of the poison was wearing off, that it wasn't as lastingly paralyzing to his earthly nerve centers as to those of Zeudian creatures around him? He flexed the muscles of his leg. The leg moved a fraction of an inch. "Dorn," he called softly, "I can move a little. Can you?" "Yes," Witcher answered. "I've been able to wriggle my fingers for several minutes. I think I could walk in an hour or two." "Then pray for that hour or two. It might mean our escape." Joyce told him of the seldom used entrance that he thought led to the open air. "I'm sure it goes to the surface, Dorn. Those woody-looking tubers had been freshly picked." 3 of the 2-legged monsters came in just then. They relapsed into lifeless silence. There was a horrible moment as the 3 paused over them longer than any of the others had. Was it obvious that the effects of the numbing poison was wearing off? Would they be bitten again? Or eaten? The Zeudians finally moved on, hissing and clicking to each other. Eventually the cold-blooded things fed, and dragged lethargically out of the cave in the direction of the pit. With every passing minute, Joyce could feel life pouring back into his numbed body. His cramped muscles were in agony now, a pain that gave him fierce pleasure. At last, risking observation, he lifted his head, and then struggled to a sitting position and looked around. No Zeudian was in sight. Evidently, they were too sure of their poisoned glands to post a guard over them. He listened intently, and could hear no dragging footsteps. He turned to Witcher, who had followed his example and was sitting up, feebly rubbing his body to restore circulation. "Now's our chance," he whispered. "Stand up and walk a little to steady your legs while I go over and get us a couple of those sharp horns. Then we'll see where that entrance of mine goes." He walked to the pile of bones and horns in the corner and selected 2 of the longest and slimmest of the ivory-like things. Just as he had rejoined Witcher, he heard the sound with which he was now so grimly familiar, the flapping, awkward footsteps. Wildly, he signaled the professor. They dropped in their tracks, just as the approaching monster stumped into the cave. For an instant, he dared hope that their movement had gone unobserved, but his hope was rudely shattered. He heard a sharp hiss, heard the Zeudian flap toward them at double-quick time. Abandoning all pretense, he sprang to his feet just as the thing reached him, its fangs gleaming wickedly in the greenish light. He leapt to the side, going 20 feet or more with the press of his earth muscles against the reduced gravity. The creature rushed on toward the professor. That game little man crouched and awaited its onslaught. But Joyce had sprung back again before the two could clash. He raised the long horn and plunged it into the smooth, purplish back. Again and again he drove it home, as the monster writhed under him. It had enormous vitality. Gashed and dripping, it yet struggled on, attempting to encircle Joyce with its stubby arms. Once it succeeded, and he felt his ribs crack as it contracted his powerful body. But a final stroke finished the savage fight. He got up and, with an incoherent cry to Witcher, raced toward the opening on which they pinned their hopes of reaching the upper air. Hissing cries and the thudding of many feet came to them just as they reached the arched mouth of the passage. But the cries and the constant pandemonium of the paralyzed animals died behind them as they bounded along the tunnel. They emerged at last into the sunlight they had never expected to see again, beside one of the great lavender trees. They paused an instant to try to get their bearings. "This way," panted Joyce as he saw, on a hard-packed path ahead of them, one of the trail marks he had blazed. Down the trail they raced, towards their space shell. Fortunately, they met none of the tremendous animals that infested the jungles, and their journey to the clearing in which the shell was lying was accomplished without accident. "We're safe now," gasped Witcher, as they came in sight of the bare lava patch. "We can outrun them 5 feet to their 1." They burst into the clearing and halted abruptly. Surrounding the shell, stumping curiously about it and touching it with their shapeless hands, were dozens of the Zoidians. "My God," groaned Joyce, "there must be at least 100 of them. We're lost for certain now." They stared with hopeless longing at the vehicle that, if only they could reach it, could carry them back to Earth. Then they turned to each other and clasped hands, without a word. The same thought was in the mind of each: to rush at the swarming monsters and fight till they were killed. There was absolutely no chance of winning through to the shell, but it was infinitely better to die fighting than be swallowed alive. So engrossed were the Zoidians by the strange thing that had fallen into their province, that Joyce and Witcher got within 100 feet of them before they turned their pale eyes in their direction. Then, baring their fangs, they streamed toward the Earthmen, just as the pursuing Zoidians entered the clearing from the jungle trail. The two prepared to die as effectively as possible. Each grasped his lance-like horn tightly. The professor mechanically adjusted his glasses more firmly on his nose. With his move, the narrowing circle of Zoidians halted. A violent clamor broke out among them. They glared at the two, but made no further step toward them. "What in the world?" began Witcher bewilderedly. "Your glasses!" Joyce shouted, gripping his shoulder. "When you moved them, they all stopped. They must be afraid of them somehow. Take them clear off and see what happens." Witcher removed his spectacles and swung them in his hand, peering nearsightedly at the crowding Zoidians. Their reaction to his simple move was remarkable. Hisses of consternation came from their lipless mouths. They faced each other uneasily, waving their stubby arms and covering their own eyes as though suddenly afraid they would lose them. Taking advantage of their indecision, Joyce and Witcher walked boldly toward them. They moved aside, forming a reluctant lane. Some of the Zoidians in the rear shoved to close in on them, but the ones in front held them back. It wasn't until the two were nearly through that the lane began to straggle into a threatening circle around them again. The Zoidians were evidently becoming reassured by the fact that Witcher continued to see all right, in spite of the little strange creature's alarming act of removing his eyes. "Do it again," breathed Joyce, perspiration beading his forehead as the giants moved closer, their fangs tentatively bared for the numbing poison stroke. Witcher popped his glasses on, then jerked them off with a cry, as though he were suffering intensely. Once more the Zoidians faltered and drew back, feeling at their own eyes. "Run!" cried Joyce, and they raced for the haven of the shell. The Zoidians swarmed after them, snarling and hissing. Barely ahead of the nearest, Joyce and Witcher dove into the open panel. They slammed it closed just as a powerful, stubby arm reached after them. There was a screaming hiss, and a cold, cartilaginous lump of flesh dropped to the floor of the shell. half of the monster's hand sheared off between the sharp edge of the door and the metal hull. Joyce threw in the generator switch. With a soft roar, the water motor exploded into action, sending the shell far into the sky. "When we return," said Joyce, adding a final 1,000 miles an hour to their speed before they should fly free of the atmosphere of Zoid, "I think we'd better come back at the head of an army, equipped with air guns and explosive bombs." "And with glasses," added the professor, taking off his spectacles and gazing at them as though seeing them for the first time. End of part 2.